Welcome back, everybody. This is Days of Noah, number 34. And the last 5 or 6 lectures have really gone into a deep dive look at the Middle East, the nations that involved in Canaan, the Promised Land, with the Canaanites. These are all the people groups that had basically lived in that area before God liberated it through Joshua and the Israelites. What we're finding is that that's where the seed of the serpent set up their dominion after the flood, was through the land of Canaan. And God always intended on bringing the seed of the woman into that area and infiltrating it and taking it over. And he particularly did not want the Israelites to begin to blend their cultures with these other groups, because he knew that Satan was the god of those groups, and they worship false idols, and the fallen angels were pulling all the strings in terms of controlling those people groups. And so this is the fulfillment of the proto-evangelium of Genesis 3, that there's going to be this perpetual enmity or strife between these two genetic groups, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. Now we know that Genesis 6 reveals a very interesting story that very few people are taught in Sunday school and in church, and that is that the fallen angels mated with women and created the hybrids. And this situation is what is going to set up all of the mythology, all of the folklore that's going to remain in human history for the rest of mankind, including today. All the concept for the superheroes, all the concepts that we see today for DNA manipulation, all the concepts we see like Conan the Barbarian, which is this big, huge man who knows how to wield a sword and conquer people. All of the mythology that we still see today with Hercules and Achilles and the movies that are made and everything in Hollywood and so on and so forth, that all stems from that pre-flood Genesis 6 account. Now, in the last few lectures, we've discussed how the ancient Indian people also had their folklore, where they talked about an ancient race of large god men who they called Hercules. And that's a Sanskrit term. And that term, that compound word, Hercules, eventually became Hercules. The Greeks added on an ES on the end, and they removed the hyphen, and that would become Hercules, or Hercules, who we all have obviously heard of many times. And the Greek version of Hercules is the same as Genesis 6. He's a demigod. He's not just a full god or a full human. He's a hybrid. He's a half human, half god. He's been given supernatural size and strength, so he's a giant, and he has supernatural power, and he is a man of myth, men of renown, which is what Genesis 6 says. Genesis 6 says that these Nephilim men, these hybrids, would become these renowned, famous men throughout all of history. And sure enough, that's exactly what's happened to Hercules. So these Nephilim, they're the ones who really kicked off the seed of the serpent in Genesis 6, and their DNA survives the flood. And that's a controversial subject. I'm not going to get into the details of how that happens, at least at this time, but nonetheless, it does happen. And we see the DNA resurface in Ham's illegitimate son, Canaan. And Canaan ends up being the father of many children, and all of them go on to become one of the evil groups of Canaanites. Now, his firstborn son is Sidon. He becomes the father of the Sidonians and the Tyrians. So what we see is that you can trace these Canaanites back across the flood to the pre-flood world, to the Genesis 6 scenario. But taking it back even further, the Genesis 6 scenario can be traced back to Cain, because the fallen angels, they mostly pursued the Kenites. Cain and Abel, we all know that story. Abel was a righteous man and Cain was a wicked man. And all of Cain's predecessors were wicked too, including Tubal-Cain, which means I will be like my father Cain. So Tubal-Cain is 7 generations removed from Cain, and all of them are wicked in between, and they all are getting worse as time goes on. And then Tubal-Cain, he is one of the most wicked, and he is the first man who really takes the whole concept of metallurgy, weapons, building, and construction, and warring to the next level. So I often refer to him as the first master mason, but if truth be told, it really goes back to Cain. Cain was the first human being to be exiled into the nomadic wastelands, where he would build the first city in Nod. He was the very first human being who developed the skills and the prowess to erect walls, make watchtowers, and build up a huge infrastructure or fortress. And it wasn't for altruistic reasons either. It was so that not only could he protect himself, but that he could go out and murder and loot and rape and steal, and then come home to his fortress, and there would not be any retribution towards him. So the first city was really built out of nefarious reasons. And when you look at the words in the Strong's Concordance in the Hebrew, that begins to be revealed very clearly. So, in my opinion, Cain is the true godfather of the Masons. His great-great-great-great-grandson Tubal-Cain becomes the real master craftsman, because he is the one who is introduced to all of the technology from the fallen angels. When the book of Enoch says that the fallen angels descended upon Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, that correlates with the days of Tubal-Cain. Tubal-Cain was living in that region at that time. And so the fallen angels revealed themselves to Tubal-Cain. They revealed all of the witchcraft, the sorcery, the metallurgy, the root cutting, all the things that are listed off in the book of Enoch. And he's the one who began to then take this master craftsmanship to the next level. And this brought about the invention of the smiths. That's another meaning of the word Cain, is the smiths. And the smiths are the metal workers. It's in their blood, it's in their DNA. It's just they just come to it naturally. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You know, we've heard that expression our whole lives, and what that essentially means is you have a lot of genetic predispositions similar to your parents. These metalworking smiths, it's not just a cultural thing. It becomes ingrained in their genetics, so that all of their ancestors are naturally gifted with metallurgy. And this is how we see the beginning of all of the metal industry. And the reason that the fallen angels did this is not for altruistic purposes. They knew the power of metal, precious metal on the planet. They knew that mankind would become obsessed with pursuing gold and silver, that they would turn them into currency, and that people would begin to exploit each other over that currency. They knew that they would use all the precious metals to make weapons and shields and breastplates and everything used in killing and taking over other people groups. They knew that they would become obsessed with pursuing gold jewelry and bracelets, and even the crown that goes on a king's head, a gold crown with diamonds in it. You know, all of these things were instituted by the fallen angels into mankind's life for the purpose of destroying mankind. So the fallen angels introduced the eternal secrets of heaven to the seed of the serpent, the Kenites, specifically Tubal-Cain and his family. This really led to the beginning of occultism and mysticism, and setting up altars and shrines to false gods, and root cutting and mixing of plants and taking drugs and and learning how to do spells and enchantments. And this is the beginning of magic and witchcraft on the planet. And mankind would then begin to learn and develop these things. The angels taught them the motion of the planets, the sun, the moon, astrology, the zodiac. All that stuff was introduced in order to worship false gods and to not worship the one true God. So all of these things, the astrology, the motions of the plants, the root cutting, those were all necessary ingredients to performing satanic rituals. When you study satanic rituals today, there are multiple facets to that ritual, and it all involves these things that mankind has learned. The motion of the planets, the sun and the moon, astrology, wind, earth, and fire, blood. So we're beginning to see a method to their madness here. So the fallen angels then taught mankind how to build and develop all the weapons and how to apply all of the sciences of geometry and alchemy. And this becomes important because mankind has to learn geometry and how to utilize geometry in order to build the sophisticated altars that they're going to pray to and sacrifice human beings to. They aren't going to just build these perfectly rectangular and triangular shaped and circular shaped pillars unless they understand geometry. And this is the origin of what's referred to as sacred geometry. And it's in the process of learning this sacred geometry and applying it through these metalworking Kenites that they build these altars and do the human sacrifices and do the satanic rituals. And this is where all the witchcraft, it all melds together. It's not just, the Masons are not just people who learn to build structures, and they're not just people who were sacrificing human beings and doing witchcraft. It's the combination of those two, building these big, huge monuments for the purpose of sacrificing and doing witchcraft. That becomes the Masonic religion that would transpire all of human history, including today. Now I believe that the Nephilim and all the hybrids and all of their genetic predecessors, they're the ones who've built all of these humongous megalithic structures and altars of past. If you go back to Days of Noah, I think it's number 7 or 8, we go through like 20 pictures of these humongous structures, some of them that are 200-ton stones, cut in perfectly right angles. The seams are so tight between these stones that you can't fit a piece of paper or a razor blade between them. To this day, some of our greatest architects and engineers say that they're not even convinced that we could recreate those structures with the precision that they have with all of our modern technology. And so you begin to understand that before the flood, it was a far more technologically and advanced world than we could have ever dreamed. But because of all the catastrophe of the flood, all of that record was for the most part wiped out. And so most of us, when we view the pre-flood world, we think about it much more primitive than it really was. The other thing we tend to do is we tend to think of these Nephilim as these wild beasts. And although they were wild, they were, cannibals and blood drinkers and bestiality and the whole 9 yards. So from a virtue standpoint, they were as unrighteous as it comes, but they were extremely intelligent too. Make no mistake about that. And what we'll see is that before the flood, and especially directly after the flood, these Nephilim groups are the ones who began developing the entire concept of kings and setting up kingdoms and creating a monarchy with a feudal system. That never existed in human history until they initiated that. And they did that for multiple reasons. One, so they could maintain the power, because whoever is holding the throne obviously has all the power. They're able to control all of the people underneath them. They're able to preserve their bloodlines because the king passes his crown to the one underneath him, and so on and so forth. And they only marry other kings who have other dominant kingdoms. and so they're able to preserve and concentrate their genetics. They figured out early on that life is in the blood, and that the blood is the most powerful thing in the world, and that you have to protect it and preserve it. And so this is the seed of the serpent. As time goes on, they build up their big, magnificent kingdoms, and they're using their architectural skills and their geometry to build these huge royal cities with castles and these big fortresses with fortified walls and gates. This is what the city of Jericho is. This is what the city of Ai is. This is what, as the scripture refers to, the royal city of Gibeon. These are all royal cities that have these large people groups living in them, and they have a hierarchy with the kings and the queens at the top. During this time that they built all this stuff, they're the first ones to design and come up with a concept of the royal arch. And this would become the huge archway that the kings and the queens would pass through as all of the people roared and worshiped and praised them. And this became such a prominent design that you see it spanning all the way through human history to today. And we're going to look at some of those pictures in a moment. And this is why we see on the front of the Masonic religion the compass and the square with the two pillars with the royal arch over the top of it. And that's why there are still organizations today that are called the Scottish Rite and the Royal Arch. It has this history going all the way back. Now, all of this whole concept that I've been discussing can be summed up in the word Atlantis. Of course, the Bible doesn't refer to the city of Atlantis, but all of our other archaeological records and writings talk about Atlantis. Atlantis was this mythological, highly technological, advanced city, this utopian society that existed before the flood, that was run and governed by a bunch of hybrid demigods. And so I would say that all that mythology and folklore is really true, that there probably really was a city. It had many names depending on which culture it was. The Greeks referred to it as Atlantis. And that was destroyed in the flood. But genetics are very fluid. All of the things that you learn, your memories, your desires, your virtues, your characteristics, it has a genetic memory and blueprint, including all the witchcraft, the sorcery, the geometry. And so even though the physical structures and the physical world was destroyed in the flood, there was a genetic blueprint of it that survived, including the DNA, and it all re-manifests and just picks up again after the flood and continues to be developed more and more with time through each of the cultures. Now, after the flood, we see that the royal arch and the pillars becomes one of the main designs of worship for the gods. And eventually, we see the formation of the pillars of Hercules all throughout the Mediterranean region. And we now know that Hercules is also who the Old Testament refers to as Bale and Moloch. Bale means Lord and Moloch means king. And the pillars of Hercules were consecrated to the wind and to the fire. So we see this which is what they use in witchcraft. And we know in the Old Testament that they sacrificed children. Human sacrifice was performed to Bale and Moloch. So we can safely assume that child sacrifice took place at the pillars of Hercules. And in fact, we have some ancient writers who even say that human sacrifice took place to the Carthaginian Hercules. So they would take their children and they would go into the pillars of Hercules, and underneath the archway, they would sacrifice their children and lift them up to the gods. So these Nephilim groups, after the flood, became very prevalent and prominent, and we're only given a little bit of clues about them. We don't know how much percentage they are. We don't know how big all of them are, but we're told about some of them, such as King Og of Bashan. He was the famous giant Amorite who was known for being this warmongering king. So when you think back when you watch some of the movies and you think back, way back in the Dark Ages, and you picture in your mind a big, huge, powerful king, a big, muscular king who almost looks like Conan the Barbarian, who's wearing a crown on his head and a lion skin on his body, and he's carrying around a coat of mail and a sword. That's King Og. He's a 15-foot tall man, 3 foot wide, powerful, large, intelligent. This is the era of these kind of kings. And there were over 31 of these kings living across the area of Canaan when Joshua came in. And the reason why, when you go back and you look at verses like Numbers 13, where Joshua and Caleb were told to go in and spy out the promised land, and they come back and they say, man, the inhabitants of this land are huge. They make us look like grasshoppers. He's not joking when he says that. He's saying that there are some humongous men there. That's why all the people were terrified. That's why all of the Israelites were terrified to go into the land. But God delivered them supernaturally. The Israelites could have never defeated any of the Canaanites under their own power of their own flesh, any more than the little shepherd boy David could have destroyed Goliath, who was 10 foot tall, wore 125 pounds of armor, and had a sword that he could thrust 3 men through and carrying him around. There's no way that David could have ever killed him. But it was through the anointing and the supernatural power of the Holy Spirit and God to allow these people to destroy these Nephilim groups. So, if you recount Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, he kind of describes the fathers of this. He talks about Cain, and I wanted to quickly review that. When Cain had traveled over many countries, he with his wife built a city named Nod, which is a place so called, and there he settled his abode, where he had his children. However, he did not accept his punishment in order to amendment, but to increase in wickedness. For he only aimed to procure everything that was from his own bodily pleasure, though it obliged him to be injurious to his neighbors. He augmented his household substance with much wealth by raping and violence. He excited his acquaintance to procure pleasures and spoils of robbery, and he became a great leader of men into wicked courses. He was also the one who introduced a change in the way of simplicity, wherein men lived before, and he was the author of measures and weights. And whereas they lived innocently and generously, while they knew nothing of such arts, he changed the world into a cunning craftiness. This is the Masonic religion right here. This cunning craftiness where he's using measures and weights and introducing weapons and things like that and building cities, that is the source of Freemasonry. He first of all set up boundaries around lands, he built cities, he fortified it with walls, and he compelled his family to come together to it, and they called it Enoch after his eldest son. Now Tubal-Cain, he exceeded all men in his strength, and he was an expert and famous in martial performances. He procured what tended to the pleasures of the body by that method, and first of all he invented the art of making brass. And because that he knew he was to be punished for Cain's murder of his brother, he made that known to his wives. Even while Adam was alive, it came to pass that the posterity of Cain became exceedingly wicked, every one successfully dying one after the other, more wicked than the former. They were intolerable in war and vehement in robberies, and if anyone were slow to murder people, yet was he bold in his profligate behavior, in acting unjustly, and doing injury for gain. So this is this wicked group of Kenites who end up becoming the Canaanites later, and they are the ones who took away the simplicity of life and turned it into all of the warmongering, money, possessing royal kingdoms that would serve all of history. Now, in the last couple lectures, we've discussed that all of the magnificent architecture of the past, I believe, has really derived from this group of people. It wasn't the Egyptians or the Greeks or the Romans, although they had specific people within each of those cultures who were part of the secret societies and who were of the Masonic faith. But they're not the ones who initiated all this. They just followed suit from the cultures before them. But rather, it really came from the hybrids. It came from the Kenites and the hybrids, who were the original master craftsmen and the master builders. This secret knowledge has been passed down from their secret societies and their royal kingdoms, from one group to another, from one culture to another. And the knowledge has been progressive in nature, meaning that they've been perfecting it over time and adding to it. For example, the Egyptians. Everybody knows that the Egyptians were amazing builders. They built these huge pyramids, and they built all of these big shrines to the pharaohs, and they were excellent in witchcraft and sorcery. That's why when Moses threw the staff down and it became a snake, the pharaoh sent in for all of his wizards and magicians, and they came in and they replicated everything that Moses did because they were fantastic sorcerers. And so they built upon the system that they learned, they added to it, and they were steeped in occultism and mysticism, and it's just grown and grown and grown all the way to today. So each culture would master the art of alchemy. That was a big thing back then, which was sort of kind of where we get chemistry from today. It was the science of metal manipulation. They mastered the art of occultism, where you blended the spirit with the physical world. This is where the concept of Hermeticism comes from, and all ancient secret societies are based on Hermetic knowledge, which has to do with the as above, so below concepts that we've studied in the past. And then they've also mastered the building and the architecture with the sacred geometry and how to build these huge religious shrines so they could practice the occultism. And this knowledge will be passed down from Egypt to Egypt and sage to sage, from cultures and cultures, through both oral and written teachings and traditions. And this is the formation of the secret societies. More occult understanding would be obtained, more rituals would be established, more architectural skills would be developed, and more societies would be formed. And more powerful royal dynasties would be created. Because for the last 4,000 years, there's always been leaders, kings and queens and archbishops and dukes and the Holy Roman Empire and even in the Holy Roman Catholic Church, the popes, they were in the lead. There's always been this elite hierarchy who controlled everything. You go back and study the Merovingians and the Carolingians and all of the different royal families of Habsburg and Romanov, and you see the same thing. A very small select few who have everything. They are in control of everything on earth, and they maintain the bloodlines, and it stays in the blood. The rest of the planet are the peasants who are, just barely surviving the Dark Ages. And so these powerful dynasties would become the royal bloodlines of the Illuminati. They are the ones who have had their eyes revealed to the truth, and they know about these bloodlines going all the way back to the beginning. They understand that there is a seed of the woman and a seed of the serpent, and they know there are Luciferians, and they serve Lucifer. They do the rituals and the child sacrifice even today so that they can stay connected with the fallen angels. And these are the ones who are obsessed with fulfilling the book of Revelations from the negative aspect. They want to set up a new world order. They want to set up a big, huge world military police state. They want all the biometric stuff in place so that they can control every detail of your life. They want to take away any kind of guns or weapons or anything like that so that there is no power structure underneath them. They want to put a chip in every single person and have you hooked up to Wi-Fi and have you hooked up to the worldwide net so that they can control every detail of your life. They want to set up a system so that you cannot buy, trade, or sell without having their mark. And they ultimately want you to take a Luciferian initiation where you deny Christ and you become part of the worldwide global consciousness, the beehive mentality, the slave mentality where you serve them and you are the useless eaters, the sheep that they control. That's what they want. And I know there's a lot of people who struggle with that concept. They think that the book of Revelations is just going to somehow, out of the blue, randomly fulfill itself sometime in the last days. Every prophecy in that book's going to happen, and it says that there's going to become a one world system where every single tribe on this planet, every tribe, every people group, and every nation will not be able to buy, trade, or sell unless they receive the mark. Every tribe. That's in Africa, in Somalia, in the deepest parts of Indonesia. They all will have to take it. The only way that can happen is if a one world system is developed. And that could only happen if you had satellites and internet and a huge infrastructure that the world has finally received. So that wasn't all by accident. This has all been part of the program. And it's taken millennia to achieve it. But nonetheless, we're finally getting close now. And that's why Jesus says that when the days of Noah return, so will be with the coming of the Son of Man, because Jesus knows what the days of Noah were like. He knows what a technologically sophisticated, genetically hybridized world it was. And he knows they were trying to destroy the image of mankind. And they had basically achieved that. And now we're entering into an era of genetic manipulation and transhumanism unlike any time we've ever seen except for the days of Noah. And in the next 20, 30 years, if we make it that long, we're going to see the genetic revolution that's going to absolutely boggle the human mind. And there's still the same elite people who are running the show. There's still these people who are getting together every year and going to the Bohemian Grove and the Bilderberg meetings and all, these people who are in the Masonic religion and the people who are in the Club of Rome and the people who are in the Jesuit priesthood and the people who are in the Rosicrucian societies and the Skull and Bones Society. There's all these little splinter groups that have made their own groups, but they're all connected to the head. They're all part of the same power structure that governs the price of oil and when we go to war in the Middle East and when we do this and what trade agreements are passed and who's going to be the leader of this country, so on and so forth. And ultimately what they're trying to do is they're trying to recreate the old world. They call it a new world order, but it's really based on the old world order before the flood. And what was going on before the flood is this right here. It's all about the genetics, the giants. You can go back and see these drawings. This is the Strait of Gibraltar. Here is an old ruin of the Temple of Hercules right here. And we see the pillars. And we see this image over here on the right of this big, huge, giant man with all these muscles carrying these huge pillars. If we could put in a 6-foot human being right here, he'd probably be this tall. This is who was controlling everything on this planet before the flood. These big, giant men who were building all of these pillars that we see. And we're going to continue to learn more about them, because if we understand them, then we're going to understand the last days. Now, I've taken some creative license here to add to these pictures, because I'm going to try and paint a picture of what it was like both before the flood and directly after. You had these cities like Tyre and Sidon. They're made up of Canaanites. The scripture already has told us that this is where the master masons live. We already know that they know how to use the metals, they know how to use the stones. They frequently travel up into Bashan in Syria and harvest the great big stones, and they bring them back down to Tyre and Sidon. And as it says in Ezekiel 26, they build their huge walls, they build their strong garrisons, they put up all their pillars and their Egyptian, the obelisks, and they build their archways, and they construct their royal cities. And in each one of these royal cities, you have a royal archway. This one here is called the Triumphant Royal Arch of Baal. Now, Baal means Lord. He is a god, and they call him Lord and King because he represents divinity and kingship of that time. And so, back in this era, these Canaanites were these large, hybridized people groups. And they were a warmongering people. They had perfected metallurgy. They wore, all of the armor. They had the axes and the swords and all of the various things that we've seen on television and throughout history. They're the ones who really kicked all that off. And so here is an image of what I would imagine it to look like thousands of years ago when they're doing a procession for the royalty to come through after they've gone out and defeated somebody in war. This big Nephilim human or man comes chucking through here on his horse with all of his armor on and his axe, and all the people are over here applauding them. This is the Royal Arch. If you look at it closely, it has a pillar right here, and it has a pillar right here, and it has an arch. It's a little different because it has the vestibule on it, but this is the pillars of Hercules. This is the Arch of Baal, same thing. And when we see some of the Masonic symbols, like this one, we see the same thing. We've got the pillars, we've got the archway, we've got the words Royal Arch. It's the same concept. Or here's another picture where you've got these large men. They're all warriors, so they all look like this guy. They've got the battle axes and the swords, and they're wearing the animal skins and the armor. And then the king, the head Nephilim king, comes through it's called the Triumphal Arch, the Triumphal Royal Arch. So this is where the kings and queens would come through, and the people would praise them after they've spoiled another group. Here he's packing a head of somebody that he cut off. That was a common thing back in those times. And we even see that with the Israelites. David cut the head off of Goliath, and he took it into the outskirts of Jerusalem for people to see it. So here is this big giant Nephilim king. He's carrying the heads of, the animals that he's slain or the people groups that he's defeated, and he's got his swords and all of his spears, and he's the biggest and the baddest of the bunch, and he's going to pass through the Triumphal Royal Arch, where he's going to receive glory and praise from all of his kinsmen, all these guys right here. That's what it was like thousands of years ago when Joshua and them came into the territories, and they traveled across the entire region of Canaan, slaughtering the 31 kings and all of the people groups with them. This is where we get concepts like Conan the Barbarian. That word is a Greek word, barbaros, and it has to do with people who are foreign to the Greeks, but barbarous is Phoenicians of a Punic origin. That means they live in the Mediterranean. They were these Phoenician peoples. They were known to lack refinement and manners, with the added notion of rudeness and brutality. They were barbarians. They were not sophisticated like the regular people, but they were barbarians. They were rude. They were brutal. They didn't have manners. They took what they wanted. They wanted women, they took them. They wanted a person's property, they took it. And they drive all the way back to Cain and that whole group of people. But when you look at the image of these barbarians, this is what I would imagine the Nephilim to be.
Even today, when we watch movies like Conan the Barbarian, you see this big, giant man. He's mythological, he's famous, he knows how to wield a sword and a shield, he's excellent with metal, and he's got this supernatural power and strength. He is what I would say he is part of that pre-flood collective consciousness that has survived throughout humanity all the way to today and is remanifesting through our thoughts and imaginations, but that was all based on some level of truth. Here's an image of Hercules right here. This was a statue of Hercules. He was this big, strong, supernatural man. Now here's one of the temple complexes of Baalbek. That is a city way up near Damascus in Syria where you have all these giant megalithic structures that no one knows exactly who and how they built them, with all kinds of altars and pillars and archways, and they were worshipers of Baal or Hercules. And you can see it's a pretty large structure. And there's a lot of big, huge buildings and pillars, and it's a large complex, and it's hard to see how big it is because we don't see any people in it, but it's quite large. So these Nephilim Canaanite giants are the ones who built all this. These guys, these big, huge warriors who had this understanding of how to use and make weapons and how to build, they're the ones who put up these big, giant pillars and quarried all these stones and built all these royal arches. I've taken the liberty to add and augment these pictures to give you a visual understanding of what it was like. Here's a regular man, and at this time period in the nation of Canaan, we had these kind of guys floating around. They were big, huge, giant men, and they were warriors, they were killers, they were looters. They carried around big metal weapons. They smashed whatever they came in contact with, and they built up their royal cities. They put their big royal arches in them, and they had certain roads that would lead into the city that after they went out and destroyed somebody, they came back through so that they could receive their praise and glory and honor. And these are the royal cities of the seed of the serpent that go back all the way through David's time, Saul, and all of the Old Testament. Same thing here. Here is a regular-sized man, and this is 10 times his height. Why would they build these structures? Why would a man like this, a weak, small human being who can't even pick up one of these stones, not one of them by himself, he has no machinery to make them, why on earth would they build an entire city with walls this high and archways this big? And the answer is they wouldn't. There's just no rational reason why they would do that. But the Bible tells us in these days that there were giants on the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of women and bore giants. And then in the Old Testament, we're told about King Og of Bashan, who's a 15-foot man. And so if you're a Bible follower, this shouldn't be a problem. There were great big, huge, giant men back in the day. Guys like this fella. Big monsters who had no problem between 2 or 3 of them muscling around and building and picking up these rocks and quarrying these stones. And they weren't just a bunch of Neanderthals who threw them in a pile. They had skills. They understood the concepts of geometry. They understood how to be master craftsmen. They were the original stonemasons of antiquity. And they did all of the ornate designs, and they're the ones who quarried all these great big huge stones and put them together to create these large cities back in the day. But because they've all been wiped off the planet for thousands of years, and because their surviving DNA has been diluted from generation to generation to generation until today, we no longer see giants anymore. So naturally, it's pretty hard for us to receive it because we haven't seen it. We're like doubting Thomas, who said, unless I can see the nail marks and stick my fingers in your ribs, I'm not going to believe that Jesus came back from the dead. And what does Jesus say to them? Blessed are those who see, but more are those who do not see and believe but have faith. So if we're going to have faith in our Bible, we need to have faith in the fact that the Genesis 6 situation happened. There are giants in the Old Testament, and they're the ones who built all the megalithic structures. Same deal here. If you go into this city, here's an average human being. Every single wall in this city for a mile, going in all different directions, is this big. Can you imagine how much rock it took for them? How many years it would have taken these human beings to quarry all this and carry it all the way to this site and then find a way to construct it and build it? And for what reason? They could have made them this tall and kept people out. There's no reason for them to have done that. But this guy, on the other hand, that's a different story. He was made and designed to build walls like this, and so he would have no problem doing it. This is called the pregnant stone of Baalbek. Now over here is Baalbek. It's a pretty good distance if you ask me. And here is the stone quarry. That means that all these stones used in Baalbek have to come from an area over here, and they got to lug them over there. And I don't know if you've went outside lately and used a shovel and tried to dig up some rocks and lug them around, but your back doesn't like it for very long. And now we're looking at a 1,500 ton stone. 1,500 tons. Look at the size of this stone compared to this camel. It has perfect right angles. It's a perfect rectangle. Somebody knew sacred geometry when they made it. They had some kind of special ability to make right angles and to cut it perfectly. How do you cut a stone that big? And then who moves this thing? Who on earth moves a 1,500 ton stone unless you got some big, huge gorillas standing around who a couple of these guys can get in here and start manipulating these stones. But there's no way that regular human beings did this. It is truly insanity to think that regular people harvested this stone. It's impossible. It is absolutely impossible. I don't care how many men you have. I don't care. Bring 1,000 men. Let them stand around a big rock and chip away at it all day long and try and create that right angle, make a perfect rectangle, and then move that thing from here over to there. Without modern technology and modern cranes and modern things like that, it just does not seem plausible at all. These are the giants of antiquity who built these structures. These big, huge men who knew how to mess with rock and wood and stone. And so the point that I'm driving at here is that this is the true secret origin of the Masons. These big men are the master masons who built these structures. They were all wicked Canaanites. They were all into witchcraft and sorcery. And it was this whole mixing of all this that would bring about this religion, if you will, to these false gods. Look at these big stones. This was a stone quarry right here. You can see all these big stones. This isn't natural. They brought all these big stones here, and then they picked them up and used them to build these. Now when you look at some of these ancient megalithic structures, if you use your imagination, it makes more sense. You take the Temple of Zeus in Athens. It's a pretty big complex, big stones. Look at this little guy over here. How is him and his buddies right here, how are they possibly going to scale this thing and put these 25-ton stones and 50-ton stones on the top here? Does anybody, they're going to hoist them up with ropes? Ropes can't pull these things. They're going to lever them somehow. They don't have any cranes or any method of lifting them up and setting them on top there. So there has to be some way to get them up there. This guy, on the other hand, you give me a handful of these big guys, and now we might be able to make some progress. So I think you get the point. The point is we've got lots of different historians who tell us, going back thousands of years, even back in King Hiram's day, he was ripping down ancient temples that were pre-flood temples and building new temples to Hercules and Astarte. And Hercules is a big giant demigod, half human, half god, who's supposed to be a man of supernatural size and strength. And our own Bible tells us in Genesis 6 that there were hybrids. So these giants are the ones who did all this stuff. And somehow, some way, they're coming back in the last days, as is all of the DNA and genetic manipulation. And here in the next couple lectures, we're going to get back to focusing our energy on what that looks like. That has a lot to do with the extraterrestrial thing. We're going to get into what exactly takes place when these people claim to be abducted by extraterrestrials, the genetic hybridization that's going on, and what the New Age and the occult people are saying about it.
So what you begin to see throughout history is mankind is just following this blueprint. This whole pre-flood era with the giants and the architecture and the royal arch and the kingdoms with the royal bloodlines and the kings and the queens. All of that becomes imprinted into the human consciousness to such a point that humanity begins to shadow this all throughout human history. And you can go back and see how mankind continues to have these processions where the kings and the queens and the royalty pass through these royal arches where they're greeted by the people and the people praise them and celebrate their victories. And of course, the people don't have any understanding of this any more than the next person. They're not standing out here applauding the kings and queens at the royal arch and saying, hey, there used to be giants that passed through these royal arches before the flood. They're the ones who actually learned how to build these arches. They're the ones who named them royal arches because their bloodline, their kings and their bloodlines passed underneath them. And now here we are thousands of years later mimicking them. They don't have any understanding of that. And that's what makes it so sexy and slick is Satan and the demonic hierarchy and the fallen angels who are running the show in the spirit realm. They recognize that their humanity are just puppets and they're just using them to continue this whole concept on and on and on and on and on. But here you can see in this rendition, you've got, the big architectural structures, the pantheon where you worship all the gods, and you've got the obelisks and the pillars and the big shrines, and here's the great big huge royal arch with with the pillars and of Hercules and these kings and queens, and this big procession is going on where they're passing through the arch and entering into the city. And here's the mob of people who are waiting to receive their king, who in those days was almost like a god. I mean, what the king said is what happened. Here you see a royal arch. Here you see a circular building. You see it in Greece. You see it in Rome. Here's a rendition of Rome. Here's Caesar. He's like God. And, they're bringing in a procession through the royal arch after they've conquered a group of people. They've got the Roman standard with the eagle on it, which dates back to the phoenix. And they've got all the arches and all the pillars. And in their mind, they're the most powerful and greatest nation in the world. But everything they have and everything they've achieved, everything they've done, it's just a shadow of things before them that were bigger and badder than them. That's why Solomon says, there's nothing new under the sun. Whatever happened is in the past repeats itself. Same thing here. The people, they are obsessed with the royalty. Here's the king or the great warrior who's passing through. And he's been groomed for this position. He got it from his father and his grandfather, all because of the blood. There's something special about this particular person due to his DNA and his genetics. Now, he may not be a giant anymore, but odds are if you could trace him all the way back 5,000 years, you'd see that genetic strain has been preserved through this royal bloodline. And now he's going to be worshipped like a god. He's going to pass through the people, and he's going to go through these royal arches all the way through this procession. All of these arches here, this is all mimicking the pre-flood world. Only it was the Nephilim who engineered all this. And the Greeks and the Romans are the ones who really mastered this, in particular the Romans. They always passed the kings and the queens and the Caesars through these arches. They built the whole Colosseum with all the gods and all the arches. And, all this is just a knockoff of the pre-flood world. And so when you really start looking, it's interesting just how many archways there are in the world. These great big huge archways. You've got the Arch of Titus. You've got the Arch of Constantine. You've got the Arch in Paris. You have the Arch of Portugal down here on the bottom left. The Arch of Belgium. The Arch of Barcelona, Spain. And it goes on. The Arch of St. Petersburg. Napoleon's Arch. There's a time when Napoleon came marching through the archway after he conquered many people. And you can guarantee that there was a supernatural Antichrist spirit working through him. And you can almost parallel him marching underneath this archway with his great mighty army after they've conquered nations. And all the people are here to greet him. And if you could back up thousands of years, you'd see the exact same thing happening with the Nephilim royal bloodlines and the Canaanites. They're the ones who instituted all these concepts that have remained with humanity ever since. Here's the Arch of Baal in Syria, the Arch of Tyre, the Arch of Caracalla in Morocco, the Royal Arch of Marcus Aurelius. So you can see there are a lot of archways in the world, royal arches. Continuing on, the Arch of Munich, Germany, the Arch of Moscow, the Arch of New Delhi in India, the Arch of Laos, the Arch in North Korea. So the whole world has adopted these arches. And humanity today sees them every day. They say, big deal. It's just a big old building, a big old archway. But you have to understand, if you go back far enough, there was a time when mankind had no clue how to build this archway. If you go back to the very, very beginning in Genesis, Adam and Eve and their predecessors, they had no clue how to do this. But then we begin to see the seed of the serpent develop. We see the smiths be born. We see the masons be born on the Kenite side. We see the hybridization. The fallen angels intervene into humanity. And then mankind begins to develop these great big huge archways to worship the gods. They build these big pillars and towers to Hercules and Bale, all for the purpose of witchcraft and astrology and human sacrifice. And these royal bloodlines slowly develop over the generations, and eventually these archways serve as these great big huge royal archways that these big Nephilim kings and queens pass through to be glorified. And then all that gets taken out. It all gets wiped out by the flood. And then after the flood, it starts to re-emerge because the same supernatural spirit, the same fallen angels, the same demons and principalities are at work. There's memory in the DNA. And so all of this starts to resurface, become remanifested. Only humanity, in their naivety, doesn't recognize its source anymore. And the whole time, Satan and the demonic are enjoying, the heck out of themselves by bringing this all about again. See, I believe if we could go back on a time machine about 4,000 years, you'd see that it's these giants are the ones who are cutting these stones and picking them up and pushing them together and creating all of these ancient structures. I thought it was really interesting when I was doing a little bit of internet searches on this and typing in like archways and giants. There are lots of images that just popped up on video games and different things that I didn't, have to doctor these images. For example, this guy on the right, he pops up right here. Now look at this guy. He's a great, big, huge, tall, giant man. You can tell that he doesn't look fully human. He's packing around a big metal axe, and he's walking through this archway. and somebody drew this and designed this, and in their mind it was just a good idea, but it was probably spiritually guided. You know, it came from their deep within their consciousness, something triggered it. Same thing over here. You've got this big giant AI robot who's chasing all these little guys, and he's passing through a huge giant archway. And so, you know, you'll see this stuff throughout art and television and things like that, and we've been subjected to it for so long that we don't even see it anymore. I mean, without someone bringing it to your consciousness, you would never notice it in a million years. How could you? The reality is that archaeologically we've discovered these giant bones in all kinds of places. There's lots of records of this, and these are the little guys. I mean, this guy here is a 14-footer or 12-footer and 6-fingered, 6-toed giant, and he is a little guy compared to what they had before the flood. There's no telling how big they were before the flood. In places like Peru, they found these large 12-foot skeletons with these elongated skulls, and people like Dr. Brian Forster has studied the DNA and looked at the mitochondrial DNA with mutations unknown in any human, primate, or animal. He goes on to say, but a few fragments I was able to sequence from this sample indicate that if these mutations will hold, then we're dealing with a new human-like creature, very distant from Homo sapiens and even Neanderthals and Denisovans. And so he goes on to say that the implications are, of course, huge. I'm not sure it will even fit into the known evolutionary tree. And so, you know, what we think we know about the past isn't exactly the truth. There's a lot of things that have been hidden from our past that have been covered up by many different forces at work. And now, as we're moving into the last days, the Lord is graciously revealing all kinds of information to lots of people, and we're beginning to put the pieces together and getting a more accurate viewpoint of what really took place. So what's more logical? To believe that this guy and his buddies cut this rock with some kind of primitive saw or chisels, copper hammers, and then they lugged it over here and built this big huge wall. This thing's 2,500 tons, and then they slid this one over here. It's another 1,500 tons, and it's cut perfectly, and they just wedged it right in there. And then a couple of these guys jumped up on this guy's shoulder over here, and they took this rock, which fits right in this seam right here. They went in and stuck that one in there, and then this guy over here, he got on top of her shoulders, and another guy got up here, and they got some ropes, and they pulled this rock over and cut it and wedged it in there. We're really gonna subscribe to that? Or maybe what the scripture says is true, that this big lug over here took this great big huge hammer and all the other eternal secrets that he was given, and he smashed these rocks and cut them and pushed them around and built this structure. And it's interesting that every ancient megalithic structure we see, from Stonehenge to the pyramids, has to involve worshiping the gods. So it's very consistent. Same thing here, Siberia, Russia, a 3,000-ton, 40-meter rocks. Look at the seam right here. Look at this. I mean, that is impressive. These seams are so tight you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. How on earth would you take a 3,000-ton rock that's 40 meters tall and fuse it together with other rocks perfectly like that? And then you start looking at the pyramids, and the pyramids are mind-boggling too, because you've got the 3 pyramids of Giza. There's 5.9 million tons of rock that was used. 2.3 million blocks were quarried. And the largest granite stones in the pyramid are found to be up to 25 to 80 tons. And they believe that they were transported from 800 kilometers away. I mean, that's insanity. We know that they used pi to build these things, which supposedly Pythagoras invented, thousands of years later. And when you study Pythagoras, you find out he was into the occult and secret societies. We know they used a compass to build these things because they sit at a 0-degree longitude and latitude within the center of its landmass. And then to make matters worse, the apex of these things line up astronomically with the stars of Orion's belt. So they have this cosmological significance. See, when you look at these three pyramids, the way they're offset right here, if you draw a line straight across here, it's exactly the same thing. These three pyramids line up with the stars of Orion's belt. Now, if you remember, the word Nephilim has some meaning in regards to Orion. They used to refer to Orion as the giant star. And of course, we know that the fallen angels descended down to Mount Hermon, which was the highest point in Syria. So if they descended to the highest landmass on earth at that time, at least in the Middle East, they came from a vantage point that was higher. Where would that be? That would be up in the star systems. They came from outer space. I don't know how that all works. They manifested themselves from a higher spiritual dimension into our universe, and then once they're into our universe, they came from the star systems, possibly Orion's belt or Sirius, and then they manifested down onto our planet. Whoever built these pyramids wasn't just thinking about it from an earthly perspective. They were also thinking about it from a cosmological perspective within the galaxy. And so we have to take that into consideration. And this is a pretty fascinating picture. The Egyptians used to worship Orion and Sirius. Where did they get that knowledge to do that from? According to the book of Enoch, it was the angels who taught them how to worship the stars and the constellations and the movement of the sun and the moon. They didn't just figure that out on their own. So they're the ones who learned all this knowledge and began to apply it. And even today, thousands of years later, the secret societies are still worshiping these things. We see this in Freemasonry today. Well, guys, I think we'll wrap this lecture up now. But as you can see, there seems to be a deception. It seems that the powers that be have erased history. The Bible gives us some clues and details, but you've got to dig pretty hard. It's difficult to go back into all those Old Testament stories and really glean all of the information. But it becomes clear that the Genesis 6 conspiracy was real. The fallen angels did hybridize mankind, and they did reveal a lot of eternal secrets that they had. And now you fast forward to today, and we're seeing that a lot of things have been covered up, that Satan and the demonic world have worked very diligently through mankind to conceal the past. And for whatever reason, now we're beginning to put the pieces together. And I certainly don't have all the answers. And I can't be certain that everything that I've revealed is 100% accurate. I'm doing my best to try and portray what those times were like. I obviously wasn't there. But I feel this is what the Holy Spirit is revealing to me. And I believe that it has to do with the last days. I believe that the reason why we're learning this information now is not a coincidence. There's a lot of people who are being revealed different pieces of the puzzle, and we're all in this together. And I greatly appreciate those of you who are on the journey with me. I realize there's a ton of videos, more than I ever dreamed of making, and they're long and sometimes they're tedious, but there's a lot of information, and we're slowly starting to come in view of the reality of the past. And I don't think it was a coincidence that Jesus said that, in the days of Noah, so will it be with the coming of the Son of Man. In other words, the same thing that provoked God to destroy the world the first time could very well be the exact thing that provokes him to come back the second time. It was not the sinfulness of man per se that brought about the flood. Man has always been fallen, and he's always been sinful from Adam all the way through. And so, although there is a lot of sin on the planet now, and it's going to continue to grow, in my opinion, I don't think the sinfulness of man today is even going to be the specific trigger that brings everything to a head, but rather we're going to see Satan continue to manipulate mankind through genetics. And what better time than the present? I mean, this is the first time since the flood in the last 5,000 years that humanity has finally gained the intelligence and ability and technology to completely distort everything from genetically modified food to modifying all the animals, and now we're seeing human modification. And this has been going on longer than you think. I mean, even dating back to the Nazis, who were obsessed with creating the Ubermensch, the Superman, this genetically altered Aryan man. And so, for almost 100 years now, we've been dabbling with DNA, and today we are really getting ready to take off with that through the transhumanism project, artificial intelligence, and that doesn't even take into consideration the whole extraterrestrial situation, where since dating back to the 1940s, thousands and thousands of human beings have reported these stories where they've been abducted and had their DNA and sperm and eggs and things taken from their body, and it's been hybridized with the extraterrestrials. And that's a direction that we'll be going here in the near future. We're still have a few more lectures to try and kind of wrap up this Old Testament, these concepts. There's more revelation about King Solomon. The next lecture I'm hoping is going to be about the six-pointed star, which I believe is the seal of Solomon and is not really the Star of David. And there is a lot of data. I'm going to present a lot of data and research going back a long ways to try and reveal and reflect that truth. And so, anyways, Godspeed, and we will see you on the next one.